If there was someone that scared the shit out of me when I was younger, it was this.
Bind, torture, kill, or BTK. Words synonymous with the serial killer, Dennis Rader.
This guy talks about killing like you and I talk about changing clothes.
Hi, I'm Nick from True Crime Uncut, and welcome to Questions With. This week we're speaking to homicide detective Tim Relph about how he helped capture the notorious BTK serial killer following 10 murders and a 30-year manhunt.
We talked to him for many hours. He indicated that this is the greatest accomplishment of his life, and he hadn't really been able to talk about it. Wichita didn't have a boogeyman, they had BTK. That's what your family was afraid of. Before then, we had never seen someone, and it would be a long time to learn it, but we'd never seen someone that killed for sport. It's hard to explain the shadow that he kind of put over the city back in the 70s, especially ladies that lived by themselves came home and checked their phone lines. People just became suspicious of people for the first time. Evidence doesn't change. You know, people's memory, people's stories, even people's recollection of what someone looks like, that all changes over time. It's just part of the human mind, but evidence doesn't change. And so I got very familiar with the crime scenes, with what evidence was available. I was born and raised in Wichita, and so when I was a small child, I knew about the Otero murders from the day it occurred, because they lived near a school that my mother would drop off a couple of my brothers and sisters to a school nearby, and so as we drove by that area, it always concerned me. The three older children had come home, and they had found their mother and father. And the first responders, or the first people that arrived at that time, they went to the bedroom, they found the father and the mother, and then the older children didn't want their younger siblings to come home and find us because they thought they were at school. And so the officers went to their elementary schools in the area and found that both of the younger siblings had not made it to school that day. And they searched the rest of the house, and on the top floor in a different bedroom, they would find the young Joey Otero. They didn't realize there was a basement because it kind of looked like a pantry door. And so they went down into the basement, and then they located in kind of a utility room. They would find the body of Josephine Otero. A lot of times in law enforcement, you grab way more than what you know, just on the possibility that something may come up. And at that time, they took into custody a lot of materials, you know, bedding and stuff like that, not really knowing what value it had at that time. And many years later, we would extract a genetic profile from a piece of that evidence. Catherine was a young girl that she lived right on the outskirts of the Wichita State campus, and on this day, her brother Kevin had come. They were having lunch, and they just went by her house. And when they went by the house, the intruder was already in the house, and the intruder tried to tie up Kevin. During that whole series of events, a struggle broke out, and the intruder would shoot Kevin. He'd shoot him twice in the forehead and shot him right here. I think he thought Kevin was dead, but by that time, he kind of lost control of Catherine. I think he tried to bind her up, but it just wasn't working, and the whole thing just came unraveled, and he would take out a knife, and he would very viciously stab her several times. And then he left thinking that he had killed her, and I don't think he realized that Kevin had run out. And Kevin got a hold of a neighbor who called the police. When the first officers got there, Catherine was still alive, but she was barely breathing, and she couldn't identify her attacker. She was taken to the hospital, and she died in surgery just a couple hours after that. Kevin describes a white male. You know, we were looking for a single person in his late 20s, 180 pounds. Now, I give Kevin credit. When you leap forward to when the person was actually caught, his description of what his clothing and everything was perfect. But back then, you know, you're talking back in the 70s, you had this archaic thing called an identikit where you had little transparencies of like a forehead and eyes and lips, and I don't care how long you worked with that identikit, the guy always came out looking the same. And some scarecrow-looking character it's not something you could put in the paper and somebody's going to say, oh, you know, I know that person. Kevin's greatest contribution was his description of what happened in the house, how he led them around, how he tied them up. That was the first time you had a pretty good indication this is probably how he acted in the Otero house. Shirley Vianne's case would be the next one. It was in a different part of town, but the binding and everything is certainly was very indicative. I can't say it was completely connected to BTK at that time, because then there was another killing of a girl named Nancy Fox. In early 1978 is when the communication came, and he claimed that he had killed the Oteros. He claimed he wouldn't tell the fifth victim. And the reason we think he didn't want to talk about Catherine Bright is there was a living witness. But he did admit to Shirley Vianne and Nancy Fox. So those 7 murders back in 1978 became directly attributed to BTK. He had made several communications. He'd sent them through the local paper at the time. And then there was a burglary in 1979, and he would later send another communication because that lady just, through the grace of God, wasn't there that night. And so he sent a communication basically explaining that she was going to be number 8. Then after that, the communications stopped, and there was a theory that he was either in jail or dead or had left the area. 600 men were tracked down throughout the country, and turned out none of them did it either. It had been very difficult at that time say that's a BTK case. And then the cases of Marine Hedge occurred a few miles outside of Wichita. Now it's almost bordering Wichita. Marine Hedge disappeared, and she's found away from her house basically in a drainage ditch. Then right about that time was the death of a lady named Vicki Wagerly. There was some things that happened at Vicki's house that were not consistent with an acquaintance or a relative or someone that she knew killing her, because the killer took Vicki's driver's license. That case was not initially connected to BTK, mainly because it was a completely different part of town. A couple years later, a lady named Dolores Davis is taken from her home, and she is found in a ravine way out in West Wichita. The scenes were different. He removed them from the house. They were older. It was usually younger women that he could isolate by themselves. The turning point that we would learn later on was during the assault on Vicki Wagerly. She fought him pretty good, and in fact, he determined, I got to change. I can't be taking on young women anymore, because he was getting older. His was a change of necessity. Because when you shoot and stab people, that's one thing, but when you're getting personal and you're choking people and you're tying them up, there's got to be a certain amount of control. Even he would come to the conclusion this was not a young man's game. He had to kind of move his ideal victim had to move to where he could control them more. And at the time, I can tell you that the sheriff's department was certainly aware that Maureen and Dolores were probably the same killer. But the connection of Maureen, Dolores, and Vicki to BTK, that would still be some years away. He sent a letter, and it was Polaroid pictures from the crime scene of Vicki Wagerly. Now, the Wichita Police Department back at the time of Vicki's murder did not use Polaroids. It wasn't the actual pictures. It was a copy from a copy machine of photographs of the crime scene. And it depicted Vicki in the crime scene. Well, Vicki was removed because they tried to save her, and so there were no pictures of Vicki in the crime scene. And so when the copy of these Polaroids arrived, and it had a moniker on the bottom where, through his writings through the years, he would put a little indicator at the bottom, and he would somehow put together the letters in almost an icon of BTK. So we were very confident that this guy was telling us that he was responsible for Vicki. And the thing is, we couldn't keep it quiet because the communication was initially sent to the Wichita Eagle, which was the local paper. They gave us a couple of days to get our collective shit together, but they were not going to hold the story. It went national right away, almost went international right away. It was constant press from that point on. We were followed by people. So when you're trying to do police work is difficult enough. When when you're trying to do it and make sure people don't follow you and don't leak information or things like that, it makes it exponentially harder. So very quickly, a congressman went to the U.S. Congress and had money set aside for a task force. And, you know, don't get me wrong, I wanted to be part of it. It was very few people get the opportunity to slay their childhood dragons. And if there was someone that scared the shit out of me when I was younger, it was this. And made me fear for my sisters. There was a core group of investigators. We were getting help from agencies, officers, everybody. This was a huge undertaking. We got several thousand leads because as soon as this hits the paper, everybody who had a weird uncle or everybody who had a bizarre guy that they'd run into on the street or anybody that hated their ex-husband, those tips poured in. And him coming back in such a public way ensured that we were going to be given resources. A whole task force needs cars, it needs radios, it needs overtime, it needs people, it needs thousands and thousands of dollars to just put all those resources into one case. A representative from Kansas went to the U.S. Congress and the Congress set aside almost $1 million. Now we didn't use hardly any of it, but just having the money, we had the freedom of, we collected thousands of samples from males whose names had been called in for any number of reasons. Even when somebody's called in, you're able to eliminate some things because, people were calling in on some knucklehead who was 30 years old. We could eliminate that pretty quickly. And had to be a male. Most people can't remember what they were doing last week, much less what were you doing back in 1974. And so the way to kind of bypass a lot of that old shoe leather that policemen and investigators used to have to go through is just swab them, because we had DNA from the Oteros and from Nancy Fox. But at that time, they didn't have any databases to compare it to. So when this thing broke, it was just decided you could spend days or weeks with each suspect, or you could see if they agreed to a swab. If there's one advantage of tracking serial killers is they have to be good for all of them. They can't look really good for one or two and then be out of the country or in the military or something during two of the other ones. They have to be available for all of the killings. As he would communicate, you would learn more and more about him, whether he wanted to provide it or not. Some of the communications that he left, it was clear he was using a major highway through Wichita, because a lot of the packages were near a highway. Everything you can learn about a killer that he doesn't know that you know is extremely valuable. He was printing things out on a laser jet, but you could tell he wasn't comfortable with a computer. So that's just one more little point that you can learn about him. And then what people are coming to the realization is that when you're out in public, there's almost always a camera somewhere. And that was something that he didn't realize. On one of the communications, he dropped in a parking lot, and the surveillance camera caught a picture of the car he was driving. It was in the Home Depot parking lot. Now, don't get me wrong, it was a little fuzzy, little tiny picture, and we didn't get no license plate or anything, but we did have a very good idea what kind of car he was driving. That's a huge break. We were starting to get things about him that through his writings, it was clear he was probably had formerly in the military. And so you start putting all these things together, but what certainly accelerated it was he sent a compact disc because he wanted to put more material than just could be written or typed. So he wanted to introduce almost chapters to a story or something like that. And of course, he asked us, be honest, because the police can't lie. Well, we can lie if we're catching a serial killer. And so through a series of communications, he was told, you can send us whatever you want us. We won't trace it. And then he sent a compact disc. The disc, this was an actual floppy, the kind that used to be, it was very thin, very floppy, but it was encased in a plastic thing. But every time you put that in there, under the properties section, it takes a note of what computer it's been in. Everybody names a computer, or the computer names itself. And so from when we got the disc, a computer forensic investigator was able to look at those properties And we knew that the disc had been in a computer for Christ Lutheran Church at 53rd and Hillside, right outside of Wichita. And then that was connected to the Word program, because he wrote a little message and then he printed it to himself so he could keep it in his own file. That's just kind of how he was. And when he hit that print command, the person who that Word program is registered to, and he had just named it Dennis. And so we knew that a guy named Dennis had access to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church. And very quickly we had found that under Christ Lutheran, they had a pastoral council. And the head of that pastoral council, the president of that pastoral council, was Dennis Rader. And so then we were off and running. As soon as they barked out a name, we got in one car and got on the highway and headed north. Through a series of communications, we knew it was going to be north of Wichita. As we were roaring down the highway, they started giving us information, and we learned that Rader had an address in Park City. We went down the street that Rader was said to have lived on. And you remember that little vehicle that was in the Home Depot parking lot? It was in Rader's driveway. And that's when you knew. You didn't know how this was going to end, but you knew we'd caught him. Outside of marriage and the birth of my children, I can't tell you anything that is as indelible in my memory as that moment driving down that street. To be blessed with the first person to drive by there and see it and know that it really was going to happen. We're really going to catch this son of a bitch. If he'd have stayed in his rocking chair and watched the Kansas sunset for the rest of his life, I'm not so arrogant to tell you we would have caught him on February the 25th of 2005. And at 12:15, he was taken into custody. We talked to him for many, many hours. It's hard for us to comprehend it, but he indicated that this is the greatest accomplishment of his life, and he hadn't really been able to talk about it. When he first did his killings, that was 1974, and it was covered locally, but this 24-hour news cycle that the world has now, he certainly realized he would be covered on a much greater scale. Well, he himself was an ordnance officer for Park City, and I think he thought that we were, brothers in the enforcement of law. And trust me, I don't know what he was thinking, because he in the interview he was showing the compact disc. He was tapping on it, saying, "Hey, you guys lied to me," and it seems almost ridiculous. You guys lied to me, like we have some explaining to do. He never ever denied who he was, but he had to be kind of convinced of, what do you got? Then he became concerned, what's going to happen to BTK's family? What about this? What about this? And eventually they cut through the bullshit and they were like, let's get past all this. Who are you? And at about the 3-hour mark, he said, "You guys got me in on BTK." Once he did that, he became almost a teacher. He hadn't been able to tell this thing for all these years, and this is his greatest accomplishment. You can't go in there and be judgmental of him, or he'll shut up. He talked for almost 34 hours and saw himself as an instructor of, as he called it, the golden age of serial killing. Once he was caught, we did a search warrant of his office. Over the years, he sent a little over 40 communications, and he would send all copies. He sent one original, and then the rest were all copies. In a drawer next to him where he worked was all those originals. And so we had the original communications, we had DNA, we had video, and of course he confessed. Well, it's just arrogance at a whole different level. Where you and I, if we killed somebody, I'd have their jewelry, like 10 miles away buried in a gopher hole. But this guy has it all right there. And because he'd been lulled into his own belief, and if he'd have just sat there and kept his mouth shut, I'm not sure we'd ever caught him. And so, that kind of arrogance and complacency came back to bite him pretty hard. It was one of those cases where it wasn't one piece, it was just an overwhelming wave of evidence that all came together. The district attorney at that time knew that the community was very curious, and even though he pled guilty, the prosecution gets to ask for the maximum sentence. And, well, in this case, the prosecutor decided to use this opportunity as kind of a mini trial and Most of these sentencing hearings take a couple of hours. This one took 3 days. And they would present evidence from the murders to kind of confirm to the community, this is really him. This is what happened. And I want you to see that this guy talks about killing like you and I talk about changing clothes. So that if there's even a thought of mercy because of his age or anything like that, that we wanted that to be completely erased. There was never any question about the outcome. He knew very early on he will never, ever get out of prison. And so I think he was more intrigued with the process, the kind of atmosphere around it, the news coverage. Dennis Rader absolutely did not want this accomplishment to go unnoticed. And in this newer time of media attention and things like that, he certainly wanted that attention. Now, don't get me wrong, he didn't want to get caught, but he wanted that attention. I'm not sure we can wrap our minds around it. His evil is a different evil because he thinks that he's entitled to it. And that is something you certainly see in serial killers, is a sense of entitlement. They're the smartest people in the room. The people they kill are, most of the time, in their opinions, nothing to society. He took pictures and he would relive these things. I don't know what you call it. If you want to call it evil, I don't. But that goes beyond most of our comprehension. You can't go to work and sit down at a desk and think, I'm going to start thinking like a serial killer, because they think like that 24/7. And things that you and I look at where you and I see beauty and see human interaction, they see opportunity. And they'll think about that opportunity for nonstop for weeks and become obsessive and justify in their mind that it is in their best interest to take a life.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Questions With, featuring Detective Tim Relph on the horrific crimes of Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. If you'd like to see more interviews with other detectives who caught the world's most evil killers, then please subscribe and hit that like button down below. Let us know in the comments which killer you'd like us to cover in a future video. I'm Nick from True Crime Uncut. Thanks for watching. See you next time.